Hello viewers, and welcome to the first episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we are going to take a look at the state that is responsible for approximately 95% of the bourbon on planet Earth. I'm talking, of course, about the Commonwealth of Kentucky. In this video we're going to take a closer look at the voting history and trends that have occurred in Kentucky going back to 2010. I've converted that data into double line graphs separated by party. I'm going to show those to you later. We're going to use that data that I've collected to try to extrapolate, try to predict what could possibly go down in November. But first, little introduction to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. As I mentioned earlier, Kentucky is a state that is quite famous for its bourbon. It's also the state that gave us the Post-it note and is the state that gave us the people that wrote the tune for Happy Birthday. Kentucky is a state that is also pretty interesting politically. The state has been a pretty reliable Republican stronghold over the last 20 years. Kentuckian voters actually have not elected a Democratic president or senator once during the 21st century. However, Kentuckians have shown a tendency to flip back and forth between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to the governorship of the state. The most recent of these elections actually occurred on November 5th, 2019, when Democratic challenger Andy Beshear defeated Republican Governor Matt Bevin. This habit of switching back and forth between parties also occurs to a lesser degree at the congressional district level as well. This actually takes us into the next section of our video, where I'm going to talk about the U.S. House elections in Kentucky, how they've been trending, and where they're going. Kentucky has 6 distinct congressional districts, and for the most part, each is pretty entrenched in either the Democrat or Republican column, depending on the urban versus rural nature of the district in question. However, there is one district that has proven itself to be closer to the center than others, and it's that last district, District number 6, seen here. District number 6 covers the city of Lexington and its suburbs, as well as the state capital, Frankfort. According to the Cook Political Reports Partisan Voting Index, the district has a partisan lean of approximately +9 into the Republican column when compared to the national average. Despite this, Democratic candidate Amy McGrath was able to compete with Republican incumbent Andy Barr, both seen here, in 2018. She came within about 3% of winning and flipping that seat. I looked to that particular election when thinking that this district might be in play. But is it really in play this November? Let's take a look at my first line graph and extrapolate. So what you're looking at now is the estimated voter turnout for House candidates going back to 2010. And this line graph is separated by party, as you can see. You may also notice that Republicans have held a pretty consistent margin of victory every election cycle, and even in some cases outvoting Democrats 2-1. This data suggests to me that the average Kentuckian voter is the reliable sort. It's for this reason that I think districts 1 through 5 are absolutely not going to change this November. It also suggests to me that District 6 is likely not going to flip this November either, despite Amy McGrath's strong showing in 2018. Democrats just have not really closed that gap at all yet. So I'm calling it now. No district flips in Kentucky this November. Let's make it official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Next, I want to talk about the election in Kentucky for the United States Senate seat. This is a race that is likely to receive a lot of media attention and monetary donations over the next few months. And it is mainly due to one reason alone, and that reason is this man here. For anyone who doesn't know, this is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who is running for his 7th, count it 7th, term as a U.S. Senator. He is running against a woman whom I have already briefly introduced, former House candidate and former Marine pilot Amy McGrath, seen here. Both McConnell's notoriety as a boogeyman for the Democrats and Amy McGrath's strong showing in 2018 are likely to be reasons that the Democratic Party is going to take an interest in this fight. Democrats are also likely to point to McConnell's negative net approval ratings, as well as his history of partisan obstruction during the Obama administration when he successfully blocked a Supreme Court nomination from being realized. Bearing all this in mind, though, about Mitch McConnell and his baggage, remember this is Kentucky. They have not sent a Democrat to the Senate since 1992. It seems like a stretch that this seat could flip, but Democrats remain optimistic. Does McGrath really have a shot this November? Let's take a look at the next line graph and see what we can learn. What you're looking at now is the Senatorial to House vote ratio for the state of Kentucky. Now what this means is how likely voters in the state are to turn out and vote for a senatorial candidate relative to the turnout for a House candidate. So the candidate with a higher percentage value here has a slight edge on the candidate with the lesser value. What's interesting to me about Kentucky from this data is that Democratic senators, even though we haven't seen one from Kentucky in a long time, have a clear advantage in this category. So why haven't Democrats been winning more Senate seats in the state of Kentucky? Well, if you'll remember our last graph, this is the turnout for House candidates. Kentuckians are just way more likely to vote for Republicans in the House. So given this fact, Democratic senatorial candidates in the state have an advantage that ultimately does not amount to very much. All right, so now's the point where we are going to extrapolate for November to see how this Senate race might turn out. This calculation is based on the direction of voters coupled with the approval rating of the incumbent. So let's go ahead and crunch them. Pollbot, take it away. All right, so according to Pollbot, Mitch McConnell is going to win this seat by approximately 9.74% of votes. While this result is likely to be disappointing to Democrats in Kentucky and nationwide, it's also important to note that this could be the first time in a long time that Democrats have come within 10% of the vote in flipping a Senate seat. Mitch McConnell has baggage and Amy McGrath has momentum, but in the state of Kentucky, that's not enough to flip a Senate seat. So let's make it official. Let's put it on our next map. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the much anticipated presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and likely Democratic challenger Joe Biden for the state of Kentucky. As I mentioned earlier, Kentucky is a state that has not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate once in the 21st century. The last candidate to be graced with that honor was former President Bill Clinton in 1992. Just for the sake of consistency, let's take a look at a third line graph to get further understanding of the inner workings of the Kentuckian voter. So now what you're seeing is the presidential to House vote ratio. This is the same type of data that the last graph was showing, except in this case, comparing the turnout for presidential candidates to House candidates rather than Senate candidates to House candidates. We see in this case that Republicans in the state have held the advantage when it comes to presidential elections. And this is interesting because, remember, this is what the Senatorial to House vote ratio graph looked like. So what is this telling us exactly? It's telling us that the average Kentucky Democrat is more enthused to vote for a Democratic senator than they are for a Democratic president. In the case of Kentucky Republicans, it is completely the opposite. Kentucky Republicans are more likely to be enthused to vote for a Republican president over a Republican senator. And if you'll remember from our last section, despite the Democratic advantage, Mitch McConnell wins his seat for a seventh time. So now one can only imagine by how much Donald Trump is going to win Kentucky this November. Oh wait, that's not true. We can use this data to extrapolate. That's right. Pollbot, extrapolate for me, please. All right, Pollbot is telling me that Donald Trump wins Kentucky by approximately 25% of the vote. Even for a Republican in Kentucky, 25% is significant. Remember, my calculations also factor in approval ratings of the incumbent, and Donald Trump is well liked in the state of Kentucky. This is likely the reason that he is going to do so much better than Mitch McConnell in the state. So Donald Trump takes Kentucky, probably one of the first states of the night to be called. It's official. Donald Trump beats Joe Biden by 25%. Let's make it official and put it on the map. Mark it. So now Kentucky is in the books for 2020. What else is there to talk about today? Let's talk a little bit about the potential political landscapes of the future in Kentucky. For old time's sake, let's bring up our 3 line graphs. First, let's take a closer look at the U.S. House elections in Kentucky over the last 10 years. I've added trend lines to both the Democrat and Republican figures to determine a slope which can tell us the rate of increase over the last several election cycles. The slope is the value that precedes the value x in the equations that you can see. And the more extreme the value of the slope, the more extreme the increase or decrease of the amount of voters every 2 years. Also bear in mind that the values on the y-axis are in the thousands. In the case of Kentucky, you'll see that Republicans have a slope of 40.4, seen here. Democrats, on the other hand, have a slope of 30.45. Now, what do these numbers mean? These numbers tell us that, on average, Republican turnout for House candidates has increased by about 40.4 thousand voters every 2 years, when compared to the value of the Democrats, 30.45 thousand voters every 2 years. This shows us that the state is still continuing to trend Republican. So what can we learn from the other 2 line graphs? The slope values for both parties in both graphs have negative values. So what this tells us is that fewer Kentuckians are voting for a president or a senator relative to their representative. You'll also notice that the value for the Democrats in both cases is a more extreme value. This can be interpreted to mean that Democrat enthusiasm is waning at a very slightly quicker rate than that of Republicans in the state. So what I take away from all of this is that Kentucky is going to continue to drift to the right as long as these trends continue. And that just about wraps it up for our first episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. I'm planning to make a lot of these videos. I'm actually doing one for every state over the next several months. I'm planning to release every Monday and Thursday. If you like what you saw today, please hit that subscribe button so you can get updates on new content. I'm also on Twitter, and I will be posting on that account which state I'm going to be covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, go ahead and give me a follow on the Twitter. Link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.